what you want to look at is where your company is now on environmental and social issues that are critical to your business. Where are you today on the areas where you can really have the most impact?
You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we're going to be discussing climate change. What is exactly? What are the different factors we should be looking at? And what should companies be doing about it? Joining me today is Paul Washington, the head of our ESG Center at the Conference Board. Paul, welcome.
Great to be with you, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So, Paul, you can't pick up a newspaper or turn on the television these days without hearing about climate change. When you talk about climate change, what do you mean exactly?
Right. Well, climate change is simply defined as long-term changes in temperature and weather patterns. But what people are really focusing on when it comes to climate change is global warming, is the Earth's surface temperatures getting hotter at an accelerated rate. So climate change is a broad topic. Really, the focus is on global warming.
Yeah, now it's interesting because back in the 60s and 70s, they were talking about climate change and global cooling and that we were going to have a new ice age.
Right.
So how much of this is, just driven by natural events and how much of it's human?
Well, there's a debate about which is bigger driver. There's a consensus in the scientific community that more recently, human activity is the primary driver of global warming. But let me note some of the areas that are just natural, right? And, they're everything from changes in the energy emitted by the sun. Like we think of the sun as constant, but it isn't. And actually, a fair amount of the warming that took place at the outset of the 20th century may well have been from changes in the sun's output. Changes in the tilt of the Earth. That happens. That brings about ice ages, right? Changes in ocean currents. So think about the Gulf Stream. That means that we've got palm trees growing in Cornwall, England, right? So as ocean currents shift, it can have a significant impact on climate. And then, of course, there are interactions with weather patterns themselves that have an impact. And finally, discrete events like volcanic eruptions. Well, that can actually drop the temperature of the Earth significantly from a single major volcanic eruption.
Yeah, and archaeologists, geologists have found that there are palm fossils up on the North Pole. So at one time, the Earth was a lot warmer than it is today. The seas were a lot higher. And other times, it's been a lot colder. And so you've got some people going, hey, this is all just, just sort of the natural stuff. So can we just get off of this? But at the same time, I think your point is the important one, which is that, humans are contributing this due to the emissions. And so why do we want to do that? Why do you want to pollute it all?
Right.
And so let's not blame humans for 100% of everything. There's some natural stuff, but let's control what we can control. And I think that's been the point of your work.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely central and essential point, because whatever you think the balance is between natural and human causes, I think it is pretty much beyond debate that humans are causing it. It is something that we do have control over.
Yeah, so fix what you have control over because you really can't control the sun.
or the Earth's tilt as much as we might hope to.
No, is it tilting left or right?
We're a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We don't opine on that.
Exactly. All right. So, let's talk about the emissions and what we can control, and those are called greenhouse gas emissions. Talk about what those are.
Right. So these are gases that are emitted from human activity, industrial activity, agricultural activity, that they're called greenhouse gas emissions because when they move their way up in the atmosphere, they have the effect of basically serving like glass in a greenhouse. They capture heat and therefore increase the warming of the planet. And they include carbon, methane, nitrous oxide, and a handful of other types of gases. So that's really what it is. That's why they're called greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, and so what are the various forms of greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so I mean, they come in various forms. They come in different from different sources. So carbon represents about 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions. That comes from burning fossil fuels, among other things, but people are very familiar with that. So that's burning coal, burning gasoline, burning natural gas, right? So people are familiar with that. Methane. That's about 16% of the greenhouse gas emissions emitted, and that comes a lot from agriculture, right? And from herds and things like that. We know how they produce methane. And then nitrous oxide, which comes from a variety of different industrial as well as agricultural sources. That's about 6% of emissions. Then there's another 2% or so that are assorted other gases. I would note, by the way, that some of these other gases that are emitted can have a proportionately much greater impact on warming than carbon, but they do tend to be a smaller percentage.
Yeah, so the reason that carbon is so much of a focus is, as you said, it's 75% of these emissions. So it's not that we shouldn't think about some of these other forms of greenhouse gases. It's just that carbon is so much of it, and it's from what you said, burning fossil fuels, but it's also breathing. When we exhale, it's carbon dioxide, and so there's just a lot that goes on, and we really got to just focus on that. As you look across the various ways that carbon is emitted, is it concentrated in certain industry sectors or certain?
It's a great question, and it's actually a little tricky to answer, because let me give you the sort of broad categories of where most of the emissions are coming from. This is within the United States. It varies around the world, but about 28% comes from transportation of its various forms. A lot of that's automobiles and trucks. Electricity production, right? So that's your power plants that are burning coal or gas. So that's about 25%. Industry generally, that's around 23%. Commercial residential buildings and uses, that's 13%. Agriculture about 10%. Worldwide agriculture is actually higher, because the percentage of the economies in other countries devoted to agriculture and the amount of their land devoted to agriculture is greater. But that gives you a sense of where, broadly speaking, the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. Why I said it's a little tricky is that, there are, we're going to probably get into this if it's okay, there are different types of categories of emissions. There are scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1 emissions are what you produce at your own company in running your operations. Scope 2 are the emissions that come from the power plant from which you're purchasing purchasing electricity, sorry. And then the third category is scope 3 emissions, which is all the emissions that are created by people who either supply you or use your products and services. So if you think about the automotive industry, as car production itself is not that big of a creator of greenhouse gas emissions. Most of their emissions come from how their cars and trucks are being used. So that's why it's sometimes a little tricky when you're talking about who are the biggest polluters, because they may not actually be the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions at their own plants, but the way their products and services are used actually are big contributors. So that's
and the reason that people have broken it out into 1, 2, and 3 is because you can say, well, you can only focus on what you can control in front of you, but that's only true to a certain extent. So that's scope 1.
Right.
You can work with your suppliers upstream or buy from people who are emitting less greenhouse gas, And so therefore, the focus by companies on scope 2 and 3, which are further up the supply chain, is, the focus is important because
Yeah,
it can help to drive change.
exactly right. So, for example, with the shift to electric vehicles is a great example of that. You may not use less electricity in producing, or you emit less in the way of greenhouse gas emissions creating them, but when they're out being used, they're adding less emissions to the environment.
Yeah, and you have to be careful with these comparisons. I have two cars. One is a plug-in that runs off of electricity, and the other is a diesel. Which one would you say is dirtier?
Probably the electric one.
Definitely the electric one. Exactly, because the electric one is run off of a coal-fired electric plant, whereas the diesel is clean diesel, and there's zero NOx, and it's got very high gas mileage. So you really have to be careful, we have to be careful as a society, that we don't just grab onto these things. And now we've done away with diesel cars in the country. Okay, but now we've put more on
right on the power plants, your scope 2 emissions, essentially, which could be coming from a coal-fired plant. So yeah, that's why this is an area where it requires people to address the emissions, even in the so-called clean energy area. I mean, if you think about technology, sure, digital technology allows services and providers services to be provided virtually. That can save transportation and so forth. But data farms create a lot of emissions. They use a lot of power, right? So it's interesting. Those things that might seem clean are not necessarily as clean as they might be. And I'll just add to it, sometimes there are negative social impacts too from the shift to renewable energy or using clean technologies. You got to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, I think this is really important. That's why you have to focus not only on scope 1 or the things that you do directly, but also scope 2 and 3, because it's all of these knock-on effects.
Right.
So, but coming back to your point, about a fourth of the carbon emission is so going back, 75% of greenhouse gases carbon, about a fourth of that is energy production. And so hence the move to try to get rid of fossil fuel-based electric production and move towards nuclear and renewables, right?
Exactly. And in fact, we are seeing progress there. We are, in fact, seeing a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the utility industry in the United States.
Well, if and this is where you don't have to go all the way to bright to make a serious impact. If you replace the coal-fired plants with natural gas, which is an easier task than blowing up all of the fossil fuel plants. But if you do that, you can make an enormous reduction in this. And I think your paper talks about that let's not try to boil the ocean. Let's try to take steps that are positive in the direction.
Absolutely right. I mean, a lot of this is harm reduction and not just complete elimination. It's why, a lot of companies have embraced a strategy of, we'll reduce emissions, but there's those things called carbon offsets, where you can actually pay people to plant forests, plant trees, which take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that helps to compensate for the carbon emissions you have. So there are a variety of strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions overall.
Are you ready to transform your business and stay ahead of the competition? Artificial intelligence is quietly reshaping the global economy, optimizing manufacturing processes, and transforming how users interact with popular platforms. Harnessing the power of AI can exponentially enhance your business's effectiveness and efficiency. However, navigating the risks associated with this transformative technology is critical. Privacy, integrity, the economy, and humanity are all at stake. That's why the Conference Board is your go-to resource for the expertise and foresight you need to leverage AI to its fullest potential and make strategic moves that propel your business forward. Unlock the possibilities AI offers your business. Visit tcb.org/AI today to access trusted insights for what's ahead and guidance on navigating the AI transformation.
So, Paul, some of this focus, you mentioned it earlier, is on methane, which is produced by livestock and in other animals. And so for a long time, people were saying, well, we're going to stop eating all protein that comes from animal sources, which may or may not be a good idea from a nutritional standpoint. But now they've discovered that, if you change the feed for livestock, you can actually knock out the methane production, which seems far simpler than let's stop having any animals in the world, right?
That's right. And one of the goals here on the Paris Agreement, right, which is the treaty of among nearly 200 countries, is to reduce or to limit the increase in Earth's temperatures to 1.5, max 2 degrees Celsius. And they talk about returning greenhouse gas emissions to pre-industrial levels. Well, that doesn't mean we go back to a pre-industrial economy. That would be disastrous, right? So we have to find ways through technology and other means to reduce greenhouse gas emissions without basically, ending global supply chains and having everyone just basically live in a sort of pre-industrial manner, never leaving home, not having electricity, that sort of thing. So we've got to get to those lower levels of emissions without that sort of radical return to an economy that no one wants to go back to.
Okay, so let's go back. You mentioned the Paris Treaty. Let's go to that and talk about the treaty, because this was a multi-nation, essentially a meeting that came together in Paris and ended in a treaty. But the intent was to take actions country by country that would lower their greenhouse gas output in order to accomplish this. Talk about the commitments that were made and who's in the treaty and who's out of the treaty.
Well, most of the world is in the treaty. I think it's about 196 signatories. The commitments were to limit the global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, and for a US audience, that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, with the objective of actually limiting it to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And so the idea here is that countries on a country by country basis are supposed to take action to bring themselves in line with those broader objectives.
Yeah, and so essentially they put a date of 2050 on it, and they said, let's try to get to zero emissions by 2050, which with the intent of lowering the global temperature by the 2 degrees Celsius, which would then get us back to pre-industrial age temperatures. Although, as we've said earlier, those temperatures have fluctuated pretty wildly over the the history of the Earth, but it's trying to get to that level that seemed to be the Goldilocks level for the planet, right?
Right. And 2050 sounds a long way away. It's not actually, when you're thinking about the transformation that has to happen to be able to get there. But what it actually means is we've got to see greenhouse gas emissions basically peak in 2025. That's just 2 years away from when we're recording this podcast in order to be able to get to where we need to be further down the pike. So this, sometimes people hear these dates, of 2040, 2050, they think, not my problem. Well, actually, we have to be making real progress right now.
Well, it's just a generation away, which is a nanosecond in the course of human history. So you're right. And the amount of change, you can't just get a nuclear plant up overnight. It takes 15 years from start to finish. So you almost need to, if you're going to use nuclear as a component of this, just as an example, I'm not advocating for or against it, but if that's part of the deal, you've got to almost get them all approved now in order to get them in place to meet these deadlines. So it's like today we need action just in order to, for the lead times on these things.
Exactly right. And, the other thing is within corporate boardrooms, if you say, well, we're aiming for this for 2050, the folks sitting around the table are thinking, well, I'm not going to be on the board then, but you've got to, that's why it's really important for companies to be thinking about their near-term targets as well as these farther out targets.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay, so you mentioned companies. Let's go to that. Why should climate change matter to companies? I mean, I know the countries,
Yeah.
the various nations around the world have made these commitments, and so therefore the companies, in order to, the companies within those countries, obviously,
Right.
A big part of that. But why does it matter directly for the stakeholders of a given company?
Well, talk about maybe 4 big impacts that climate change can happen and on a company. First is, we are all affected. Companies are affected by the weather events that are brought about by climate change. So that can be wildfires and droughts, rising sea levels, biodiversity loss, a whole lot of natural effects that affect the companies physically, right? Their own operations. They can certainly affect their supply chain. So to the extent that climate change is killing off species, right? Reducing biodiversity, half of our global GDP is dependent on biodiversity. So if you eliminate the species that provide the raw materials for products and services, while you've got supply chain disruptions, you can threaten the whole future of your business. So that's another impact. There's another place where companies are affected by climate change, and frankly, that's regulation. When we surveyed CEOs earlier this year, one of the top concerns that they have about this whole area is increased regulation, which is whether it's from the SEC or now particularly from the European Union, coming out with quite strict disclosure regulations and eventually compliance regulations aimed at climate. So that's the regulatory impact. And then, of course, there's the transition to renewable energies, moving away from fossil fuels toward more renewable energy sources. That is a multi-trillion dollar effort that's going to have a huge impact on companies' operations.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there to unpack, but this whole regulatory area, you talked about in terms of disclosures and why companies need to act, but regulation plays a big factor in meeting these goals as well, because a lot of the changes that need to be made are subject to, pretty onerous regulations. So talk about the role that the government can play here, just in terms of simplifying processes.
Yeah, well, look, some of this is just the transition to renewable energy is going to require changes in all sorts of operations and in the sources of electricity. And so just the permitting process that currently happens, whether it's at the local level or at the the state and federal level, there's a lot that government can do to either facilitate this transition or to impede it. We've recently done a roundtable on sustainability in the healthcare sector. That is a highly regulated area. And just the ability, it took a long time for hospitals to be able to get the ability to use renewable energy as a backup source instead of fossil fuel powered generators, right? So there's a whole set of regulations that have sort of codified existing operational practices that make the transition to renewable energy much tougher. So it's not just the direct regulations of electricity or carbon emissions. It's a lot of the other regulations that exist applicable to energies that are sort of freezing in place their current way of operating that will impede the transition to renewables.
So businesses should really be working with governments, local and federal, around the world to try to simplify these in order to make their goals. But let's go back to inside the company itself. Well, if you were a CEO today running a company, what should you be doing as it relates to global warming, in addition to the reporting requirements, which of course they have to do, what actions would you suggest they take?
I think I would first think about climate as a core part, but just part of a broader set of issues. We call them ESG issues, but let's phrase it in terms of environmental and social responsibility. I would say, what you want to look at is where your company is now on environmental and social issues that are critical to your business. Where are you today on the areas where you can really have the most impact? Where do you want to go? Where do you need to go because of regulation? Where do you want to go? And then how do you get there? So essentially, you build environmental and social considerations into your basic strategic business planning processes, right? So that your company is operating not only in the long-term interests of its shareholders, but also in the long-term interests of its other stakeholders, its customers, employees, society at large, and the natural environment. So essentially, you're building sustainability, including climate, into your strategy. And then where does that play out? It plays out in three big areas. It plays out in the products and services you sell to the market and that you buy from the market. So it plays out in the marketplace. It plays out in your own operations. Are we running in an environmentally responsible manner? It plays out in terms of your workforce. And finally, it plays out in terms of the positions you take in the public space. With respect to public policy matters, interacting, as you just said, with government regulators. So I would make sure that you don't have this sort of separate sustainability strategy. You build sustainability into your business strategy and then have it play out in the marketplace, the workplace, and the public space.
So it sounds to me like, first of all, businesses need to set their objectives. What are we trying to accomplish by what date? And it seems logical to align the goal of a carbon free or a greenhouse gas free by 2020. So therefore, then you got to work backwards. And first of all, it requires data. You have to figure out, okay, and that's scope 1, 2, and 3, which is why we went through that.
Right.
What are you emitting and how? And even if you're not producing anything, you got an office, you're emitting carbon. So you got to measure it. What do you have now? And then to your point, you have to say, okay, now what steps do we need to take pretty quickly here in order to back it down in scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? So there's a lot of work.
There's a lot of work. Yeah, what I described sounded low. Well, I can do that. No, but there's a whole lot of work. Like even apart from reporting, you should know what companies should know what their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are. Scope 3 is, it's much harder to estimate, but it is possible to do that. But you know what? One thing we're hearing from companies is, not that the SEC may require you or the European Union may require you to report on your scope 1 emissions. Companies are realizing that, well, you know what? That monitor hasn't worked for a few years. So people actually have a lot of physical work to do to make sure that they're tracking their emissions appropriately. And then, of course, just managing the massive amount of data here is a huge challenge for companies.
But I think, in most cases, if companies really document where the emissions are coming from and plan, their capital investments to eliminate them, they're going to actually find out that they're going to reduce their costs. So this isn't like, let's just destroy the P&L of the company and deliver no shareholder value. You can actually deliver more shareholder value because there's a lot of waste in this process as well.
That's exactly right, Steve. So look, there's, when we did this survey of, it's called the C-Suite Outlook Survey. And I'd encourage everyone to go look at our C-Suite Outlook report, the conference book put out earlier this year. About 49% of CEOs around the world see the transition to renewable energy as good for their business. In fact, I actually think it's going to be proved to be an even higher percent of CEOs will come to this view, because you can, in fact, have less expensive and more reliable energy for your company. So there's, and that's a transition to renewables, and just reducing your energy usage can be a huge cost saving. So again, like mentioning the healthcare sector, hospitals have found ways to significantly reduce their energy costs here that can result in a lot more money available for patient care.
Yeah, and then we can share it across industries and across the globe to help accelerate this. So there's benefit to the globe and the broader the broader climate issues, but also directly to everybody's companies.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting about this area, because it used to be that climate and sustainability were siloed within companies. It's just some people over there, maybe they thought of as tree huggers, who cared about this stuff. Now sustainability has gone mainstream, and each company, most companies are saying, okay, how do we build this into our business? But the really interesting thing about this is you're building sustainability into a business that makes sense for your company, but you've got to do this actually with the broader picture in mind of what we're trying to accomplish environmentally, socially, economically. And, we actually have a set of roundtable convenings coming up that are focusing exactly on that, how companies can set their ESG goals with this broader picture in mind, because it's different from setting your ordinary business goals, because you do have this broader environmental and social picture.
Very well put. Paul Washington, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Steve. Real pleasure to be with you.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in economics, geopolitics, ESG, public policy, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with everybody who wants to reduce their carbon output. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.